On the dock at the Nuremberg Trials, Hermann Göring looked almost absurd. Bloated, heavy, more like a character from a grotesque fairy tale than one of the architects of the Third Reich. The illusion vanished the moment he was allowed to speak. With sharp wit and verbal precision, the defendant began steering prosecutors into semantic traps, twisting the logic of the courtroom in his favor. Hermann Göring was a brilliant orator, one who, even his enemies admitted, rivaled Hitler himself. Former president of the Reichstag, Reichsmarschall of Germany, Göring did not flee. He voluntarily surrendered to the Americans. Many historians believe he did so simply to survive, but survival, as it turned out, was not the outcome he expected. How could a highly intelligent, fearless, lightning-fast Nazi leader, a man with an IQ of 138, fail to foresee his fate? What truly motivated Göring to surrender voluntarily, and was his confidence in acquittal ever justified? As Göring himself declared in court, the victor will always be the judge and the vanquished the accused. But by then those words came too late for him. The roles had already been assigned, and the world, preparing for the post-war era, was confronting the horrors of the war at the Nuremberg Trials. Long before Nuremberg, Hermann Göring had learned to see himself not as a thug or an extremist, but as a man of history. There was a time when Göring was a genuine national hero. During the First World War, he fought on the Western Front, first as an infantryman, then as a fighter pilot, drawn to the newest and most dangerous technology of modern warfare. By the end of the war, Göring commanded the legendary Richthofen fighter wing, the elite unit once led by the Red Baron himself. He finished the war with 22 confirmed aerial victories and Germany's highest military decorations. To Göring, this mattered profoundly. In his own mind, heroes were not criminals. They were builders of nations. Germany's defeat in 1918 destroyed not only the empire, but Göring's sense of justice. Demobilized as a captain, he survived by performing stunt flights across Scandinavia, watching from abroad as Germany sank into poverty, humiliation, and political chaos. Like many veterans, he did not see defeat as the result of failure, but as betrayal. When Göring returned to Germany in 1922, he believed his mission was clear: to fight for the liberation of the German people. He identified enemies everywhere: Britain, France, Bolsheviks, Jews, anyone he believed stood in the way of Germany's revival. Adolf Hitler's worldview fit neatly into this narrative, and Göring, the decorated war hero, quickly became one of the movement's most valuable assets. Hitler gained legitimacy through Göring. Göring gained purpose through Hitler. Within months, the celebrated ace was placed in charge of the SA, the Nazi Party's main paramilitary force. When the Nazis won the 1932 elections and became the largest party in Germany, Göring was elected president of the Reichstag, a position he would hold until the very end of the Third Reich. By 1945, despite a long-standing morphine addiction dating back to wounds sustained during the Beer Hall Putsch, Göring had accumulated an astonishing list of titles: Prime Minister of Prussia, Minister of Aviation, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, Reichsmarschall, and officially designated successor to Hitler himself. These were not the titles of a criminal in Göring's mind, they were the credentials of a statesman. The rewards were immense: wealth, prestige, residences, power, and adoration. In return, Göring lent his authority to increasingly catastrophic and brutal policies. But even as the Reich collapsed around him, Göring believed he would survive it. He was convinced that history would make room for him. Because Göring did not believe he had committed crimes. He believed he had conducted politics. At Nuremberg, he repeatedly returned to this idea. War, he argued, was the business of states, and if guilt existed, it belonged to nations, not individuals. If Germany itself stood accused, then how could one man be singled out? In Göring's worldview, he was not Hitler's successor in tyranny, but Bismarck's successor in statecraft. And in his mind, a post-war Germany would still need men like him to govern it. That belief would shape everything he did next. For Hermann Göring, the First World War was not simply a memory. It was a framework through which he understood the world. Germany had lost in 1918. The Kaiser abdicated. The empire collapsed, And yet, no German generals stood trial, no ministers were hanged, no court summoned the men who had led the country into catastrophe. The defeated elite was humiliated politically, but never criminally punished. To Göring, this became a lesson. He learned that defeat did not lead to justice, but to negotiation, that wars ended with treaties, not courtrooms, that responsibility dissolved into history. The Treaty of Versailles punished Germany as a state, not Germans as individuals. Reparations were imposed, territory was taken, but those who had made the decision survived, many of them comfortably. For veterans like Göring, this confirmed a dangerous idea. Political leaders were judged by outcomes, not by law. This belief followed him into the Second World War. When Germany began losing again, Göring instinctively expected the same ending: another collapse, another armistice, another round of diplomacy between great powers. In his mind, Nuremberg was not a court. It was a negotiating table he had not yet been invited to. He had seen this movie before. Even the concept of war crimes felt alien to him. During World War I, bombing cities, sinking ships, and killing civilians had already blurred moral lines. Göring, a pioneer of air warfare, had been celebrated, not condemned, for mastering a new and brutal form of combat. From his perspective, the rules had not changed. Only the victors had. This is why Göring consistently underestimated the danger he was in. He believed the Allies would eventually need experienced administrators to rebuild Germany, men who understood power, men who could command loyalty, men like himself. In Göring's mental map of history, there was no precedent for what was coming. The First World War taught him that the powerful are never judged, only replaced. That lesson shaped his confidence far more than arrogance ever did, and it was exactly that lesson that Nuremberg was designed to destroy. At Nuremberg, Hermann Göring was fighting his final war. This time, the battlefield was not the air or the streets of Berlin, but the courtroom itself, and his weapons were sharp intellect, extraordinary memory, theatrical instinct, and an almost icy self-control. The Allies quickly realized the danger. Göring was the tribunal's primary intellectual and psychological adversary. If he succeeded in discrediting the process, if he turned the trial into a political farce, that would be his last and greatest victory. From the very first days, Göring assumed the role of primus inter pares first, among equals on the defendant's bench. He positioned himself as the informal leader of the defense, and his strategy was layered and calculated. First, he projected contempt and superiority, and behaved not like a criminal pleading for mercy, but like a statesman forced to endure the judgment of the victors. His answers often turned into lectures on state necessity and a will of the Führer, delivered with confidence and condescension. Second, he weaponized legal nuance. Göring demanded precise wording, seized on minor inaccuracies, and drowned substantive accusations in procedural debates. When confronted with contradictions, he showed no embarrassment, only agility. He would adjust his testimony, cite faulty memory, or claim the question had been misunderstood. Third, he attempted to fragment responsibility. His core defense was simple and persistent. I was a soldier and a patriot. Political decisions were Hitler's alone. I did not know the true scale of the crimes. This was a calculated fiction. Göring was not an apolitical officer. He had overseen the Aryanization of the German economy, helped create the Gestapo, and stood at the ideological center of the regime. But he believed rhetoric could blur that reality. Finally, he tried to fracture the unity of the prosecution. Göring sensed the emerging tensions between the Allies, especially as the Cold War loomed, and subtly played to them. He flattered the Western powers while directing his sharpest attacks toward the Soviet Union, hoping to turn political reality into legal advantage. This strategy had a real effect. During the cross-examination of March 18 to 19, 1946, Robert Jackson, the American chief prosecutor and an exceptional jurist, suffered a noticeable tactical setback. Göring, confident and aggressive, repeatedly turned Jackson's questions against him, provoking visible discomfort and even faint smiles among the other defendants. One exchange became emblematic. Jackson pressed Göring on Hitler's absolute authority. Jackson asked, "So you claim that the German people were bound to obey Hitler's will without question?" Göring said, In every nation, the people follow the leadership they trust. That is not unique to Germany. The implication was unmistakable and dangerous. Göring was not answering the charge. He was reframing it, transforming criminal obedience into a universal political phenomenon. For a moment, he appeared not as the accused, but as the man explaining the world to the court. Observers noticed the effect. Gustav Gilbert, the American psychologist assigned to monitor the defendants, later wrote that Göring retained an aura of command, even in prison. He sought to dominate conversations, influence fellow prisoners, and assert psychological pressure even over guards. This reinforced Göring's central illusion that intelligence and charisma could still save him, that if he spoke long enough, cleverly enough, confidently enough, the logic of power would reassert itself. But Nuremberg was not a duel of words, and Göring had mistaken performance for control. For a long time, Hermann Göring believed he would escape the worst. The growing tensions between the former allies gave him hope. The cracks were already visible, east against west. Former unity turning into rivalry. Göring followed this closely and remained remarkably confident. Prosecutors, judges, journalists, many later admitted that he was one of the most difficult defendants to confront. Göring clearly intended to end the trial on his own terms. If not acquittal, then at least imprisonment, anything with the gallows. In court, he alternated between mockery and provocation. He lied openly, then laughed at the accusations. He treated the trial as a grand historical stage and himself as one of its leading actors. Göring claimed he could justify everything: the banning of trade unions, the destruction of parliamentarianism, even the concentration camps. Democracy, he argued, had simply arrived too early for Germany. Hitler's measures, in his view, were not crimes but necessities. He did not admit guilt, and he never expressed remorse. Even as the verdict approached, Göring clung to the belief that history was still on his side. From his prison cell, he wrote a letter to Winston Churchill, a letter not of apology but of accusation. He denounced the trial as a cheap spectacle, a distortion of historical truth, orchestrated by legal sophists who, he claimed, were unfit to judge the fate of nations. Churchill, Göring insisted, knew better. A statesman, after all, should understand that the great problems of history are never solved in courtrooms. It was the voice of a man who still believed he was addressing an equal. The prosecution demanded the death penalty, and in his final statement, Göring responded not with fear but defiance. The victor will always be the judge, and the vanquished the accused. I do not recognize the judgment of this tribunal. I am glad that I have been sentenced to death, for those who sit in prison are never made martyrs. On October 1, 1946, the verdict was announced. The International Military Tribunal sentences you to death by hanging. The presiding judge added that Göring's guilt was unprecedented, and his crime so monstrous that no justification could exist. For the first time, Göring's confidence cracked. He'd expected death, or so he claimed, but not this kind of death. Hanging was a disgraceful punishment, the fate of thieves and traitors. Soldiers were shot, marshals were not hanged. Göring waited in his cell for 2 weeks, telling himself he would meet death as a martyr. But the method mattered, it always had. On October 15, 1946, Hermann Göring was found dead in his cell. Beside his body lay a short note: "Marshals are not hanged." The man who believed he would outlive the Reich, who never truly accepted defeat, delivered his final verdict himself, not as a criminal in his own eyes, but as a statesman refusing to accept the judgment of a new world.